I'm David Barton-Grimley, Strategy Director for FinTech right here at 11FS. And in this series, in collaboration with Visa, we are shining a light on FinTech trends in different parts of the world. In this first half of the series, we're looking closer at Europe and taking a deep dive into everything from e-commerce to digital wallets and AI. In each episode, we will explore a particular country or region within Europe to explore each topic in a little bit more detail. In this episode, we're looking at PSD3, the upcoming legislation building on PSD2. We want to look at the opportunities and challenges PSD3 might bring to the European market, with particular focus on France. What do we think the opportunities are? Who stands to benefit the most? And how does this all build on the foundation that PSD2 created? It must be said that PSD3 is still in draft and could be subject to change, but it's always fun to speculate with what we know so far. So without further ado, to have this conversation, I'm delighted to be joined by a panel of fantastic guests. Firstly, a big hello to my co-host from Visa, Eddie Onaga, Vice President, Head of Digital and Partnerships at Europe. Welcome to the show, Eddie. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your role?
Thank you, David. It's great to be here. So as you heard, I'm the Head of Digital Partnerships for Visa in Europe. And my team is responsible for Visa's European relationships with about 30 big global technology companies and payment enablers. I've been with Visa for about a decade in a variety of roles across the world, including the US, Germany, France, and now the UK. Pleased to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. Great to have you here. And next up, we have Katja Lehr, Managing Director, EMEA Payments and Commerce Solutions at JPMorgan Chase. Thanks for joining us. Please, can you give us a bit of an outline of your role at JPM? And also, it'd be good to hear JPM's maybe broader position in the European payments market.
Sure. Happy to, David. First of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about something I'm really excited about. I know for some this might be sounding strange, but regulation, I think, is an exciting topic. About me and JPMorgan, at JPMorgan, I am responsible for what we call industry engagement and advocacy. In essence, my team and I look at any payment-related regulations in EMEA, evaluate the files, assess the impact, and ensure that our internal and external stakeholders are aware of what is happening and what to expect. And given JPMorgan's international remit, this is actually a particular interesting role as it allows us to look at the industry and regulatory developments from a very broad perspective, bringing the global view into Europe and vice versa, Europe into a global perspective. JPMorgan is a global bank and with great focus and attention on Europe. We've been operating in Europe for almost 200 years, and I happen to sit in Frankfurt. And later this year, we are celebrating our 100th anniversary in Germany. We process payments in more than 160 countries and in more than 120 currencies. And on a daily basis, we process about roughly $10 trillion.
Nice. Thanks, Katja. Just a small amount of money there then. And last but not least, we are joined by Adam Baldwin, Head of Digital Advisory at BNP Paribas. Thanks for being here with us. Can you also tell us a little bit about yourself and your role?
Thanks, David. Yes, so I'm at BNP Paribas in their global banking team, where I head up digital advisory and sitting under the chief digital officer. So what I effectively do is, it's a broad role managing the risks and challenges associated with the bank's digital banking offer, which includes, fintech and payments. Primarily, I'm there to support our internal functions, business lines, and engage with external players while we build our product suite and deliver it to our global client base. And fintech and payments is an area we've been active in for a number of years. So with this topic in particular, there's a lot of interest at the bank as we prepare for PSD3 and what it has on offer for us.
Awesome. Right. That's our panel. Now, before we dive in, just a bit of a disclaimer, and as a reminder, listeners, that the views or opinions of our panel are their own and don't necessarily reflect those of the companies they're representing. And as always, nothing we should say should be taken as tax, financial, or legal advice. Please do your own research. Don't listen to us. But also, please do listen to us, just for this podcast. So, Eddie, let's start off with the Visa position. I'd love to hear from you, the third Payment Services Directive. So that's the full title of PSD3. It's very broad. It has the opportunity to make European payments easier, faster, more secure. So from your perspective, why is it an exciting time right now in Europe and also France?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would combine just generally my response on PSD3 with the companion PSR that's going through. As folks listening will know that certain elements of the PSD2 directive were pulled out into PSR, into regulation directly, and some was left onto PSD3. So with that said, I think our view is that PSD2 was a significant step forward in improving the security of electronic payments and paving the way for greater openness in financial data. And it's made a huge positive impact for consumer protection and fraud protection. But in a lot of cases, it's been at the cost of good customer experience and user experience. And so from our perspective, I think PSD3 and PSR provide a way to improve these areas further. And we welcome the Commission's proposal to update the legal framework for retail payments in Europe. There's a lot of good things in here. It's extremely dense. And if you think of all the companion pieces of regulation legislation being discussed, it's quite a broad amount of information that's covered. But we think in general it's going to provide more openness and accountability for ecosystem partners. As you may have mentioned, PSD3 and PSR are still being finalized, but there's a couple of lessons, I think, from our time implementing PSD2 that we think are still applicable. And the first is that we need to create a framework that strikes the right balance between security and user experience. And the second is that the regulatory framework needs to be considerate of the future. PSD3 is going to come into effect sometime in 2026, 2027, and then be enforced for 10 years after that. And if you think back 10 years from now, or backwards 10 years, on what payments were like, it hardly recognizable. And if you take that forward 10 years, there's going to be use cases and experiences that we can't quite imagine right now. So having that flexibility to be able to accommodate those experiences is really critical. But overall, I'm excited to see how PSD3 is going to spur the next generation of payments in Europe, and also equally happy to hear from our other guests on how they're seeing the space.
Katja, what's your view? What excites you the most about the upcoming regs?
Well, I guess, so first, I do believe that Europe is leading the pack. That's a very broad statement, but I do believe that Europe, when it comes to regulation, certainly also for historic reasons, does lead, and the rest of the world follows. And I think we have quite a number of examples where we see that Europe has started, whether it's being instant payments, open banking, SCA, which was then ultimately followed by other jurisdictions, and still is being followed by other jurisdiction. And I think it's very interesting when you attend a conference and you would expect most probably to meet a European regulator. But then interestingly, you also stumble across US regulator or the Australian regulator. So I do believe it is interesting. It's always a challenge when you're the first to do something. But so I think this makes it very exciting being here in Europe, that we do lead with those topics. And then I think the other part, which I do believe is exciting and is different when we compare ourselves with other parts of the world, is the fact that Europe is 27, or the European Union is 27 countries, and we all have our own payment flavors, we all have our nuances, we all have our history. So it isn't easy to just stand up and say, now you're 27 countries, 27 different payment methods, or actually even more than 27 payment methods. Now you all come together and you have one pan-European payment method, and it all works the same no matter where in the European Union you are. So I think this is a challenge. And while we have a tendency to always look at the things which do not work so well or which haven't gone so well, I think we can be a bit proud of what we have achieved so far. And I truly believe that PSD3 will just contribute to an even bigger success in Europe when it comes to harmonized payments and on a really secure and consumer protected way.
Awesome. Adam, what's your view?
you'll be pleased to know I share the excitement as well. To be honest, I think, I think what's really positive in especially the way that the EC have approached this is they haven't been looking to sort of regulate after the event. I think they've seen the successes of PSD2, and with PSD3, they're just trying to provide this clear framework for future innovation. And I think this complements lots of other work they're doing in this space, be it the instant payments mandate, financial data access framework. It's all kind of coming together in a neat package that all players and consumers can have a nice sort of advanced clarity of where we're going in Europe with regards to payments. And I think that's exciting in itself because it shows that we're forward looking. I say we, obviously I'm in London, unfortunately, so it's a collective we as BNP Paribas. We're being based in Paris primarily. But I think we as the European continent can benefit with the work that the EC has been pushing in this space. And yeah, I think excitement is definitely the key word, because regulation often gets a bad reputation. It's a directive in this sense, but any form of legislation, people, especially larger legacy players, are quite hesitant when these things get announced. But I think framing it as this framework for future innovation is the positive step we all need to take. And I think, as Katja said, it puts Europe on the map, and it shows that they're leading in this area.
I'd like to dive a little bit into some of the opportunities that the directive brings forward. I mean, Eddie, you started off by saying that actually, it's incredibly dense. It's extremely broad, and it covers everything from, strengthened anti-fraud, cross-border payments, transparency and accessibility. I'd like to just sort of ask the panel, which of these, and I appreciate it might be a little bit difficult, which of these are the biggest opportunities that you feel the industry and the market is really calling for, that might make a change to the next 10, 15 years in the future?
That's a great question. I think being a payments-focused company, SEA is one of the most exciting spaces. And I think specifically around the future of inherence models. So what we've seen in the past with PSD2 was that you had to have two separate forms of authentication, right? So it could be biometric, it could be inherence, it could be something that's known. And with PSD3, they've now updated that so that it can be multiple unrelated items from the same category, which we think is a great. And also in terms of the things that you are, historically we thought of that as things like biometrics, but increasingly we see a lot of opportunity in the area of behavioral biometrics. So the spending habits that someone may have. And the reason why that's exciting for us is because it's a way to both secure authentication, but also do it in a very seamless way behind the scenes, in a way that doesn't disrupt the cardholder or consumer. So again, threading that needle between increasing security while also not creating a really bad user experience.
And that's really interesting. And in some cases, that might even enhance the user experience. I mean, it's interesting what you say. And I understand, I mean, maybe somebody correct me if I'm wrong, that part of what's coming up or is proposed to come up is the ability for businesses to share more of that behavioral data with the issuers. So, you can actually use some of this data, albeit in a very protected way, to be able to derive insight. And I'm guessing that, is extremely relevant for SCA, but it might also be relevant for all sorts of other things that you can maybe do with that data. So it gets very exciting.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that, I think it's something within the bank, especially on the more sort of corporate side, that we've been sort of focused on for a few years with regards to SCA. With a lot of our banking platforms, we've had to explore many different forms of customer authentication throughout the world, and I think we've picked up on a lot of the pain points that customers and our corporate clients have had to face, and how that can have a massive impact on how successful products and services are. So at the retail and current consumer level, I think it's great that PSD3 is enhancing that even more, off the shoulders of PSD2. And as you say, addressing at the same time some of those other risks that have impacted growth in this area around, fraud and anti-money laundering and all those sorts of risks. So kind of almost linking it back to the point I was making before around it being a framework, all of this is connecting really nicely. And what we're noticing as well around potential opportunities is that if you have better consumer trust through, SCA and better security for the consumer, they'll share more data, which in turn, with more data, allows the banks or the payment service providers to spot potential risks, and then that increases security. So this framework that PSD3 and the analogous regulations are presenting gives so much opportunity in that regard. So, as you say, lots of opportunities based just on securing the customer's identification.
Yeah, absolutely. It all starts there. What's your view, Katja?
I do completely agree with what Eddie and Adam said, but I have another one. There's several, but the one I really appreciate, and Eddie talked about it earlier, that the PSD3 remains a directive and focuses primarily on the licensing and the operation of payment services. And then we have the PSR, which actually then takes on everything else of PSD2, and that is the regulation. And I think this is the real good part for any institution specifically, which is operating in various jurisdictions. So what we've seen with PSD2, when you have to, or when you transpose something into local law, the directive always has to be transposed into local law. We do see that countries implement it with nuances. There's always differences. Now, that's going to go away. With the PSR being a regulation, we will not have to cater for all these various nuances per country. So that's going to make it much easier from an implementation perspective. But I also would want to say that there are good benefits if you can actually compare apples with apples and not have to say, oh, in one country it's an apple, in another country it's an orange. That makes it really difficult. So now we have the opportunity. It is the same, no matter what country we look into, no matter what country has implemented it. And that is going to be a great opportunity and benefit, I think, for not only for the banks, but also for our clients.
So the PSR is a harmonizing force, which didn't exist before in PSD2. Eddie.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think you may be able to tell from my accent, I'm originally from the US. And if you told an American that you can actually innovate through regulation, they may look at you funny. But I've spent 6 years now in Europe, and this is really just a great example of that, where you have a kind of forcing function that's coming down from the top, and as Katja mentioned, as a directive, it creates a lot of challenges because every country is going to implement things differently. But the second it comes in as kind of the standardized approach, it really is going to shift the market. So you've already had some forcing functions with PSD2, both in open banking and strong customer authentication, but it just kind of continues that trend. And would definitely agree with her first statement around Europe really leading the world in these spaces.
So we've been talking so far about, how excited we are and the opportunities. Now let's talk a little bit about challenges, because I'm sure with something so broad and vast that there are many associated challenges that come with it. Adam, I'd love to come to you on this, from a bank perspective. What are the challenges in keeping up to pace with something like this and complying with it?
It's a really good question aimed at banks, actually, because I think historically legacy banks have always had the enviable position of having those customer contracts effectively, and let's be honest, gatekeeping them until such point at which legislators step in and say, hey, you have to share. So I think it's been a slower change with many banks that perhaps saw the customers as their own and not willing to share. Those banks that were a bit more innovative and sort of saw where this was heading, invested early, got their technology up to speed, invested in APIs, and were way ahead of the game. And I think that's where the costs are always going to feature with banks in this space. So compliance with the regulation is really going to equate to investing into technology and ensuring that from a an API perspective and beyond, that you are ready to connect with everyone that you need to, that you're ready to manage and share the data in compliance with the directive as and when it's implemented. So I think for a bank, the costs themselves, they are going to be substantial, but mainly because we have to deal with a lot of legacy tech, and that's, I'm afraid it's an evergreen issue in large banks. I'm sure Katja would agree with that, but it's a cost I think that's worth bearing, because I think, I'm sure we'll focus on France in due course, but that's definitely what I picked up, back when PSD2 was implemented, that many French banks just weren't ready from a technology perspective to start implementing PSD2 at the pace of other banks, and especially, compare it to the UK. So getting your tech ready is probably the biggest step that banks need to take. And it's the biggest challenge, but I think it's one that if they put in the effort now, prior to 2026, it will make that transition a lot smoother as we progress.
And Adam, I'm glad you mentioned France there. Would you say, looking forward to PSD3, that the banks in France are more prepared now to implement particular parts of the directive?
Definitely. I mean, I think, again, especially back when PSD2 was around, obviously the UK was still in the EU just about, and we were, as a bank, it was very much pushing together as one, and it often felt like the UK and other European locations were sort of leading the charge, and the French entities were able to benefit from the advancements of the wider BNP network. Many of BNP's competitors at the time were sort of dragging their heels slightly. I found a lot of banks were implementing APIs, but purely for that basic level of compliance for PSD2, your minimum sort of data access, rather than any sort of end-to-end service in this space. This time, and perhaps it's because they're sensing real business opportunity and a real shift in the market, I'm getting a sense that a lot of banks are now fully investing in this space. And even just the last year, I've noticed a lot of banks either acquiring or partnering with more agile fintechs in France and really leveraging on the technology that's already in place. So I think there's a different appetite to payments this time around. Perhaps, fingers burnt slightly from being slower in comparison to their, European neighbours. The French banks now seem a lot more prepared.
I think that also definitely resonates from a UK perspective with open banking. There was definitely a, let's just do the bare minimum to comply and see what actually happens here. So it's always what comes next that's in some ways more interesting. Eddie, I'd love to give you the final word on France. I mean, what's your view on how PSD3 might impact particularly the business models of fintechs and FS firms in France?
Definitely, that's a great question. And when we ask our fintech partners in market how they're thinking about PSD3, a lot of them will be fairly transparent to say they haven't really gone into the weeds of what it might mean. They're still focused around PSD2, and also, given their focus on the present, they don't want to necessarily start thinking about the future for something that isn't finalized yet. That said, there's a ton of opportunity in the open banking side of things. So I mentioned earlier the strong customer authentication side is one area that Visa is really keen on, but just the ability to access more data, to provide consumers a dashboard around how they can access their data and control their data, and the fact that that data quality is going to be better, is all things that a wider range of fintechs and businesses will be able to take advantage of. So I think there's a lot of excitement there, but it will probably really start kicking off in the coming months.
All right. So coming up, we look at whether customer expectations have changed as a result of open banking and if PSD3 will address some of those expectations. So we'll be back after this quick break. Don't go anywhere.
Visa's FinTech Fast Track program is streamlining the onboarding process for fintechs, enabling them to gain access to Visa's powerful capabilities and network. Visa and their enablement partners help fintechs launch and scale cards, virtual credentials, and disbursement programs. To learn more, visit partner.visa.com.
Welcome back to Fintech Insider Focus, where we are taking a close look at the challenges and opportunities that could be created as a result of the incoming PSD3 legislation. And I'd like to start by taking a bit of a reflection back into PSD2. So as was said much earlier in the podcast, it was just such a transformational change in payments in general, all over the world. The world looked to Europe to really lead the way. So Katja, I'd like to come to you on this first. So, PSD3, very obviously by the number, builds on PSD2. So what would you say from your view has been the impact of PSD2 to customers? How have customer expectations changed as a result of what people can do these days with payments?
Well, if you look back on the topic we actually discussed earlier in this podcast, and we mentioned several times with the sharing of data, open banking, and I know that open banking on one hand is sharing of data, on the other hand it's payment initiation. It existed before PSD2, but PSD2 wrapped a legal framework around it and made what was called screen scraping a proper approach. It gave it the touch of this is legal, this you can do. And I think with moving something which actually was used, so there was a consumer need for it. The consumer, the user asked for it and used it. But it came always with a bit of this gray area, dirty approach or dirty place. It now has a completely okay place, it's legal, and it is safe, because not only with PSD2 was it put in a legal frame, and we banks were given a direction, but it was also now a completely different view to the consumer. It is okay. Now, there is more opportunity, because when we look at what we've done as the industry, and Adam alluded to it, we have a bit more leeway to go. We have done APIs, we have provided the access, but I think there is more to do, especially when it comes to user experience. So rather than providing the bare minimum and making it a bit more difficult, a bit more clicks, a bit more language to read before you actually get to what you actually want to do, I think there is opportunity. And it will be shown. I think the consumer and the user will see it and will be more willing to use these new opportunities, these new products and services, which actually is what the Commission is pushing for. Let's move out of just one way to do things into several ways to do things. Let's have data sharing as something which is at the heart of the consumer, is used to very happy to say, okay, I want X from you. Here is my information, so you can give me X, and do it in a very easy way. And at the same time, feel safe by doing so. Additionally, I want to say we're seeing from the user is, okay, you don't give me a good user experience. You are not making it smooth for me, so I will change. So loyalty from a client and loyalty from the user base has changed. So there is much more appetite to say, hey, I know that this is my right. I know that I can do that, but you won't let me do it, or you're making it so difficult to me. So I'm going to go somewhere else where I have a much better user experience. So I think PSD3 has just made it, or PSD2 has made it much clearer to the user and to the consumer, hey, you have rights, you can do things, and we will make sure as a commission, as a legislator, that you're actually getting your rights. So, and PSD3 will continue that, and we will be seeing more demand from the user and from our clients to actually make it easy on them.
There's a really interesting cultural nuance I'd like to go into a little bit. So, for example, there's a perception that French customers in particular are quite cautious about data sharing with third parties, and I'm sure there are other countries in the EU that share some of those cultural traits. The EU is a bloc; it isn't by any means homogenous. I mean, Adam, I'd like to get your view on, would French customers be more open to this kind of data sharing? How could fintechs educate customers on the benefits and win them around?
Yeah, I mean, I think traditionally it's a fair reflection of the average sort of French consumer. I mean, I remember reading a Statistica report, I think back in 2019, that showed only maybe 35% of French consumers had actually adopted a fintech product at that point. And the primary driver for that was exactly as you say, David, it was, data security, sharing, trust, these key suspicions that stopped them entering that market. I think by comparison at the time, the UK sat at 70%. But that may be more to do with, UK banking structure changing quite rapidly at that time, banks closing, and we were forced to go to digital offerings as soon as possible just to, get any banking services. But jokes aside, I think what COVID did across the world, it had the same impact. But I think in France now especially, going through that digital revolution so rapidly, it has had a massive shift in consumer appetite and around data. I mean, we noticed this in the bank overnight. Even rolling out simple products internally within the bank, such as e-signature, we noted that COVID, being that stimulus, suddenly removed a lot of fear over certain technologies because they were forced upon consumers across Europe. And suddenly, once they realised that there is security involved, it is a safe method of doing business, that those fears subsided. And I think that's what we've sort of figured, what we've noticed now over the past few years in France. The latest stats around, number of APIs and API usage within the payment space in France, it's just gone astronomical. And that's probably helped by the fact that the major banks in France, BNP, SocGen, and Crédit Agricole, have all released their own APIs. So I think they are sending a positive messages to their own, customer base, which is the majority of the French population, that this is technology and industry shift that we're backing. Therefore, you can have faith in your retail banks to support this. So now I think we're at a stage where, France sits, only second to the UK and Germany in the number of API calls for payments. So it's a real shift in that sort of 4 or 5 year space where I think that has translated to different consumer behavior now driving future change.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, COVID did have this almost instantaneous spur. I mean, even just from cash, we talk a lot about the UK, as you say, as being ahead of France in many ways, but there were very much loads of parts of the UK that were absolutely cash focused, which all of a sudden, I mean, I remember going on a holiday to Cornwall, your classic place that would never accept a card. I tried to pay in cash and they just looked at me funny. And that was overnight. And so you're right. I think you might be seeing that all over the EU and all over the world. Eddie, I'd love to get your view from your view and also Visa's perspective on how you see customer behavior, end user behavior changing as a result of PSD2.
As a result of PSD2 or PSD3, or I guess a combination of the two?
Well, I suppose it would be from PSD2 coming into, like, what is the foundational change that you see happening at the moment that people are expecting, that PSD3 would I don't know, lift, advance, or yeah?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think it all comes down to that enhanced, secure user experience. So just this idea that you can provide a better user experience, you're going to get a transaction through. Consumers expect that. Merchants like it. Banks like it. Everyone likes it. It's good for the ecosystem. And that's just going to become business as usual and really drive better consumer experiences across the board. I think that's going to be the number one thing that continues to be on consumer minds. I think the other area that is going to be interesting is the evolution of fraud. So as we start driving fraud out of these areas that we are used to today, let's say card-based fraud, you're going to see it migrate into the other areas. There's some saying around fraud goes to the weakest link in the chain. And so how do we identify that? How do we block those before they become bigger problems? How do we get everyone in the ecosystem aligned around how to tackle that problem? Because it's not just a consumer problem or not just a bank problem. There's issues around fraud that are starting to proliferate, particularly around scams that don't fit the business model of how fraud used to look like. And so how will kind of PSD3 start thinking and addressing those types of issues? I think that's going to be another area that's going to be top of mind for consumers.
Yeah, and I hate to be the one that uses the generative AI keyword in the podcast, because I'm sure every podcast uses that. But yes, I mean, all of that kind of stuff is going to be making fraud a hell of a lot worse. In fact, already is. So I think this legislation is extremely important. And also, Eddie, I just want to pick up very briefly on what you said about your background in the US, because of course the US's approach to this is just so fundamentally different to state-driven regulation that forces this through. I mean, would you say that this way of driving the market forward gives the EU the edge, or is the way maybe that non-EU markets have embraced open banking is a better way?
I think I'm going to use that caveat that you put up front, that this is my view, not necessarily Visa's view. And just seeing how different markets operate, I think it's very it's interesting what the trade-offs are. Definitely if you compare things like security and that harmonization of security, Europe is definitely much further along than the US. And that said, historically, I think the US has taken a view that on electronic transactions, the user experience is more important. And so let's not do two-factor authentication. Let's not do SEA. That's going to be a poor customer experience, which we don't want, which has led to high rates of fraud. I think Europe's initial view was let's put a lot of hurdles in to try to get rid of fraud, which didn't necessarily create the best user experiences. But I think where Europe's really come out on top is now being able to figure out how to have high levels of security with low levels of user friction. And I think that is a really great outcome. And I hope that others in the world really go down that track. And I think what's interesting watching our digital partners and fintech partners is a lot of the biggest companies in the US will look to Europe as their number 2 market. And a lot of the biggest companies in Europe will look at the US as their number 2 market. And so there's going to be a lot of user experience crossover between these 2 markets. And I think, as an American, getting to experience open banking and strong customer authentication here in a seamless way kind of makes me wonder, okay, why can't we replicate that when I go visit my folks back in California?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot that both markets can learn from each other. I mean, Katja, what's your view? Will PSD3 put Europe ahead?
I guess in the beginning I already made that very proud statement, and I'm happy to repeat it. I do believe yes. I similar to Eddie, while he is American, I did live in the US for quite a while, and especially around the introduction of PSD2 and open banking. And it was interesting to see when Europe pushed for it, and you saw all these fintechs come up and say there's a huge opportunity. Ultimately, there was a move offering this product also in the US. And so what I had observed at the time was that clearly the US regulator, the Canadian regulator, they all got their ears up and said, oh, that's interesting. And so with many of these countries, US and Canada, others as well, basically said, okay, we really do not want this to be regulated, because when you look at the way Europe regulates things, it's always with the consumer protection first. And so when you see in retrospective what the US and Canada did, they basically said, okay, we will come up with a solution. Let's the market sort it out. And they did. They actually put together a set of rules. They put together a set of APIs. Now, depending on who you're going to ask, the answer is going to be different. But why having the financial industry and service providers come together and put together the rules and the APIs, it is still with the lens of a financial institution. It is not necessarily with the lens of a consumer and consumer protection and all. And I think Eddie mentioned it, the smooth experience. So it is a different approach. And we all know that at least US and Canada regulators are now looking into maybe the need to regulate it in order to get actually this smooth and secure user experience.
And Adam, I'd love to come to you for a final word. I mean, your regulation is only as good as, the institutions that implement those regulations and the things they bring to market to help customers. I mean, just on France, is there a specific angle, if they're more ahead than maybe some of the other countries in the EU, that they can use this as a way to really boost the fintech industry there?
I think that they're definitely approaching it, as I say, with a lot more rigor than perhaps before. And I think it's for multiple reasons. I think, the focus on the consumer and the customer, I think that's always been, a very French viewpoint of looking after the individual, I think is key. But obviously there's a lot of business opportunity in this space, not only for the legacy players, but the French fintech scene, which has been growing. So I think there is a lot more demand to take an active role in this. And as we were discussing earlier around implementing the directive, it'll be interesting to see what approach they take and how they interpret it, and if there's any sort of nuances within France that makes it a more attractive space for further fintech growth. But like I said, what I would say this time is there's more excitement. There's less fear from all players at all levels. It's much more excitement around, okay, great, the EU is putting a clear mark in the sand globally that we're going to regulate, we're creating this framework for innovation, let's go. And I think France will be fully behind it this time.
Amazing. And maybe just one thing to add, for myself, it has been remarkable to see how France has really transformed itself over the last few years to become a country that attracts VC investment for fintech and for startups in general. I mean, I remember trying to do a startup there like 15 years ago, and it was just almost impossible. There was just no money. I mean, you couldn't pitch to anyone because there were no VCs. And so now there really is a huge industry there that's just growing and growing. So that's wonderful. Katja, Adam, Eddie, thank you so much. That wraps up today's discussion. Thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find out more about all of you and your companies? Eddie, let's start with you and Visa.
LinkedIn and Visa.com. And also on the open banking side, Visa has also acquired some years ago a company called Tink that is heavily into open banking and also looking at expansion to the US. So look them up as well.
Definitely go check out Tink. Yeah. And Katja.
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn at Katja Lehr, and you can learn more about JPMorgan Payments at jpmorgan.com/payments.
And Adam?
Yes, also on LinkedIn, and for BNP Paribas, was bnpparibas.com. And then one of our payments specialist businesses is called Acceptor with an X. So it's definitely worth looking at what they're doing, because they're doing some amazing stuff in France, bringing lots of cool products and services together for our corporate clients.
Awesome. And you can find me as well on LinkedIn. Thanks for listening, everyone. If you like what you've heard, follow our podcast and don't forget to leave us a review. It helps us to make it better and helps others to find the show. As always, if you want to join the conversation, find us on social media. Just search for 11FS or Fintech Insider, or email podcasts@11fs.com. Thanks very much and goodbye.